Progressive parties are disintegrating across the Western world. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to discuss the structural crisis underpinning progressive politics in the Western world. Now, I don't mean just the next election, short-term cycle. A lot of things can influence a given election in a given place at a particular time based on short-term factors. The pandemic, for example. What I'm discussing is the grand strategic outlook of these political parties and why they are facing such an existential crisis. There are two main reasons. One is a crisis of change, and one is a crisis of constituency. Progressive parties must effect change. That is part of being a progressive. You see something that is wrong in the society and you seek to change it. You say, okay, women don't have voting rights. We think they should. We want to effect that change. And so long as the change being sought can achieve broad brush appeal, the progressive politicians have social currency. So for example, if you want to introduce same-sex marriage and you get the support not only of the gay community, but a broad number, coalition of other people within the society, they might support that change and those politicians that advocate for it. And this is true for universal healthcare, universal education, workers' rights, time off on holiday, bereavement leave, all of those kinds of things. There's something common to all of them, which is that they benefit a very large number of people. Even the same-sex marriage issue is like, okay, 10% of the population plus all the people that have gay relatives and friends, okay? So this is something that it has appealed to a large number of people and is resisted by those people that don't want to see that change or are cautious about introducing radical changes to something that would perhaps in their view work well as it is. They would be the conservatives, okay? So that's all well and good. But once you've achieved changes in a society that everybody agrees have been positive, you have to find new causes. And if you don't find new causes, then you are no longer a progressive, you become a conservative. And a lot of people have moved from progressive to conservative for that reason. And we see that play out very strongly in the gender ideology debates. So you had the radical feminists of the 60s and 70s and 80s, the Germaine Greers, people that would absolutely be considered feminists like J.K. Rowling, who are also gender essentialists, who don't believe that gender is an ideology or that you can change your gender on the basis of your own particular self-identity, that there were some actual objective characteristics and experiences that go around that. And that debate has created a schism, a fissure within that discourse. This is a problem for progressive politics generally, because as you find more and more fringe issues to advocate for with smaller and smaller constituencies, two things happen. One, it's the most radical elements that then represent your party because they're the ones arguing for these kind of activist causes. And two, you don't win elections because people aren't interested in those subjects. A good example would be 20 years ago, you would have left-wing politicians saying that we believe in fairness at work, job security, families and growth. Well, these are all messages that people can get their minds around. But if you say, look, we believe that 5-year-olds should be able to choosing their own sex, well, that's something that is much more contentious and certainly not a bread and butter issue of everyday Australians, Americans and British. So this is the first problem with progressive politics. The second problem is one of constituency. Any major party, any major coalition requires a broad church of support. So for example, on the conservative side, you've got both religious conservatives and libertarians, and they would wildly disagree on certain major topics like, gambling, pornography, that sort of thing. You'd have the conservatives saying, look, we need to ban these things. These create social harms. They victimize people. They create all kinds of social ills and displacement and so forth. And you have the libertarians saying, no, we want to gamble on the porn, right? This is like, people want to live free. But they do agree on certain fundamental principles: the sovereignty of the individual, freedom of choice, freedom from government oppression, these sorts of things, freedom of speech. These are things that these kind of groups will agree on and coalesce around, and conserving those positive institutions like family and society and roles within the community, and volunteerism and all the rest of it. Whereas on the progressive side, you've now got a coalition of convenience, not of principle, coalition of convenience that don't really have much to say about one another, or say to one another, except in extreme cases. So the classic example of this would be the increasing kind of diverse sort of Muslim minorities within the Western societies, because the left-wing politicians are the ones that are always protecting sort of diversity of minority religious views. They're protecting Muslims from associations and connotations in the media from terrorism and things like that. And so the Muslims, for example, generally speaking, recognize that the left-wing politicians are out for their interests, right? Meanwhile, they don't have the same values as the inner city, latte-sipping leftists who are wearing the purple hair and out there with the gay pride parades and the gender, flags and so forth. And a great example of that is the same-sex marriage debate in Australia. The most anti-same-sex marriage electorates in Australia were all left-leaning electorates. Why? Because they were Muslim majority areas. Western Sydney had like 80% anti-same-sex marriage, completely flipping the overall kind of result. Obviously it passed with an overwhelming majority, but it was these left-leaning areas. So what you had was left-leaning voters who were socially conservative. And they weren't even necessarily even that economically conservative. They voted not because of an activist ideology, but because they saw where their representatives had their best interests at heart. And this is the only reason they vote for them. If you contrast that with 20 or 30 years ago, in Australia, 40% of the workplace was unionised. The maritime workers, the shoppers' unions, all of these sorts of things, mass support. People who would vote the Labor Party just because they happen to be a worker, right? Well, in a world where only 7% of the workforce is unionised, everyone's in casual work, people work 2 or 3 jobs, they move from place to place, they are self-employed. Well, what does that even mean anymore? The left-leaning social progressive parties have not been able to move with the mainstream views, and that has intensified even further them clinging to these fringe subject issues. The last kind of cause that I think has general public currency would be climate change, where regrettably it has become a partisan issue where the left-leaning have taken on the cause of climate change and the conservative parties have largely dismissed it. But it has the problem of affecting different groups to different degrees. Much like pandemic and lockdowns and things like that, it's all well and good to be, strong action on climate change if it's not your job, if it's not your community, if you're not the one in the mining sector or you're not the one who relies on that power plant. These are workers who would traditionally have voted Labor, but are no longer able to do so because they realise that voting themselves out of a job, voting their families out of a living, is not something that they can countenance. And so the right-leaning parties, the conservative parties, don't have this problem. They have their own challenges, but they don't have that existential crisis. And until such time as the progressive politicians worldwide can articulate what progressive politics means in 2021, the 21st century, that goes beyond slogans of diversity and inclusion and things that when you drill down to individual policies don't mean much, and when they do, they don't have any broad appeal at all. Well, they're going to continue to write themselves out of the conversation, and we will continue to see massive conservative majorities winning elections, as we have been seeing in Britain and the United States. Even in the last election in the United States, where the Democrats, yes, they won the White House, but they lost basically every state legislature, and there is no indication that there is a broad coalition lining up behind Biden. We had Boris Johnson, of course, under the Brexit wave, winning a massive landslide majority. These issues are going to continue to play out for many years to come, until such time as progressive politics manages to bring themselves back to the mainstream of their own societies. That's my view. Please leave your comments down below. If you're a left-leaning politician or aspiring activist or whatever, please leave all your hate messages. It's perfectly fine. Just be polite about it, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much. Goodbye.